In a world driven by ideas, Kale Voss was cursed with a mind that could never create anything new. Every breakthrough he pursued, every innovation he dreamed of, someone else had beaten him to it. Until the day he changed everything. When he invented the Echo Lens, a device that glimpses potential futures, Kale thought he had finally found his purpose. But after a brutal betrayal, the lens is stolen, and Kale is left for dead. That's when the real transformation begins. Now, his thoughts no longer belong to him alone. Every idea, every concept he envisions is instantly stored in a mental archive, a vault of the mind, a limitless database he can access at will. He doesn't need to write, type, or speak to record his thoughts. His mind is now a living, breathing supercomputer. But knowledge is power, and power invites danger. As Kale joins forces with rogue agent Sarah Cade, he must race against time to retrieve the lens before it's used to control the future itself. However, the more Kale changes the course of events, the more he realizes one terrifying truth. If the future is written, can it ever be unwritten? Table of Contents. Act 1. The Invention and Betrayal. The man who never had an original thought, Kale's struggle with creativity and his lifelong frustration. Breakthrough and obsession, the birth of the Echo Lens and its hidden consequences. A deal with the wrong people, a violent betrayal and Kale's near-death experience. Rebirth in the dark, Kale's rescue and introduction to Sarah Cade. The mind awakens, Kale's mental transformation begins. Act 2. The hunt for the Echo Lens. Visions of shadows, tracking the stolen device and glimpsing a deadly future. The future fights back, the consequences of altering fate. The ethics of knowing, the morality of seeing the future before it happens. False identities, escaping a global manhunt. The architect of fate, learning who truly controls the Echo Lens. Act 3. Conspiracies and betrayals. A mind too powerful, Kale's abilities grow beyond comprehension. The price of genius, Sarah's real motives come to light. A future that cannot change, is destiny inevitable? The betrayal of trust, a shocking deception alters everything. Breaking reality, Kale reaches the limits of his abilities. Act 4. The Final Gambit. Awakening to truth, Kale's mind evolves once more. The last vision, the ultimate future is revealed. The mastermind revealed, a final enemy steps forward. Unwritten future, the fate of the Echo Lens is decided. Visions of deception, a mind-blowing ending that changes everything. Chapter 1. The Man Who Never Had an Original Thought. Kale Voss sat in his dimly lit apartment, surrounded by stacks of notebooks, half-sketched designs, and abandoned projects. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages of his latest idea, an energy-efficient microprocessor that could revolutionize artificial intelligence. His heart pounded with anticipation as he typed the concept into a search engine. Within seconds, the answer came back, cutting through him like a blade, patented 2 years ago. A strangled sound escaped his throat. Not again. He pushed away from the desk, his chair rolling back with a screech. It was always the same. Every time he thought he had stumbled onto something groundbreaking, something world-changing, he would discover someone else had beaten him to it. Sometimes by a few months, sometimes by decades. The universe seemed to be laughing at him, ensuring that no matter how intelligent he was, no matter how hard he worked, he would never be first. And yet, Kale couldn't stop trying. His mind was a relentless machine, constantly cycling through concepts, hypotheses, and blueprints. But what good was a brilliant mind if it only echoed the thoughts of those who had come before? He was nothing more than a ghost in the world of innovation, always chasing shadows, always just a step too late. He clenched his fists and paced across the small room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books on quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and computational theory. He had dedicated his life to knowledge, devouring every field that intrigued him, hoping that one day, one spark of inspiration would come solely from him. The frustration had long since turned into something darker. It gnawed at his soul, whispering that he was a fraud, a parasite leeching off the genius of others. He had spent years convincing himself that he simply needed to work harder, to push his mind further. But tonight, as he stared at the glaring screen displaying another wasted idea, he felt something shift inside him. Desperation. If he couldn't create something new, then maybe he needed to change the way he thought. Kale sat back down and opened a blank page in his journal. He picked up his pen, hesitated, then wrote 3 words: the echo lens. A device that could glimpse possible futures. Not in a metaphysical sense, not through mysticism or prophecy, but through raw, unfiltered data. If the mind was nothing more than an incredibly complex predictive engine, constantly calculating outcomes, then why couldn't it be amplified? Why couldn't he build something that could give him an edge, a device that would let him see what could happen before it did? He scribbled furiously, diagrams and equations taking form on the page. The idea expanded, evolved, reshaped itself into something he had never quite considered before. His pulse quickened, his thoughts surged faster than he could write. This is it, this is mine. For the first time in his life, Cale felt a flicker of hope. He had no idea that in less than a week, this very invention would lead to his death. Or at least, that's what the world would believe. Cale's mind refused to rest. He stayed up long into the night, expanding on the concept of the echo lens. The idea burned in his brain, refusing to be ignored. He had read about predictive algorithms before, but this would be something different, something personal. He imagined a world where decisions were no longer based on guesswork or intuition but on real-time glimpses of potential futures. Governments would kill for it. Corporations would wage wars in the shadows to control it. But most of all, it would change the way humanity functioned at its core. He envisioned individuals wearing the lens, making perfect choices in business, relationships, even warfare. An entire world where mistakes ceased to exist. But that thought made his stomach turn. Mistakes, after all, were a crucial part of progress. If people never made wrong choices, could they ever truly grow? He shook off the unease and pressed forward. He needed to test the concept, to prove it could work. The problem was, he had no idea where to start. Hours passed in a blur of research, scribbled calculations, and caffeine-fueled determination. He hadn't eaten since early afternoon, but hunger was an afterthought now. His body was nothing more than a vessel, carrying his mind as it raced towards something extraordinary. Finally, exhaustion took hold. His eyes burned from staring at the pages before him. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, a slow, bitter smile forming on his lips. Would this idea, too, be taken from him before it could truly begin? As his eyelids grew heavy, a distant memory surfaced, the day he had built his first invention. He had been 7 years old, fashioning a crude, makeshift radio out of spare parts from his father's broken transistor. His father had laughed, tousled his hair, and called him a genius. That was the last time he had truly felt like one. Tomorrow, he would begin building the prototype. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would change his life forever. Chapter 2. The Spark of Creation. Cale woke to the rhythmic hum of his apartment's air filtration system, his body stiff from having passed out at his desk. His journal lay open before him, pages filled with frenetic scrawls and hastily drawn diagrams of the echo lens. He sat up, rubbing his bleary eyes, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. For the first time in years, he felt something close to excitement, something wholly original was within his grasp. But excitement quickly gave way to pragmatism. He needed funding, materials, and above all, a workspace more sophisticated than his cramped apartment. His thoughts drifted to Synapse Labs, a private research facility that specialized in cutting-edge technological advancements. He had once applied for a position there but had been rejected. Not innovative enough, they had told him. The sting of that rejection still lingered. Still, there was one person at Synapse who might listen. Dr. Elias Mercer, the lab's lead engineer, had always respected Cale's mind, even if the board had dismissed him. If he could convince Elias of the echo lens's potential, he might have a chance to bring it to life. Cale retrieved his phone and hesitated. He had barely spoken to Elias in over a year, and the idea of reaching out now, with nothing but rough sketches and a desperate need for resources, felt reckless. But what choice did he have? He tapped out a message and hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came faster than he expected. Meet me at Synapse in 1 hour. Cale arrived at the Synapse Labs headquarters, a sleek glass and steel structure that towered over the rest of the business district. He swallowed the nerves threatening to rise in his throat as he stepped into the lobby, nodding at the receptionist before being granted access to the research floors. Elias was waiting for him in a private lab, surrounded by half-assembled prototypes and humming machinery. He looked up as Cale entered, a knowing smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "You must really be desperate if you're coming to me, Elias said, crossing his arms. Kale let out a dry laugh. Desperate? No. Inspired? Maybe. Elias gestured toward an empty stool, and Kale took a seat. Let's hear it, he said. You've got my attention. Kale took a deep breath and pulled out his journal, flipping to the pages filled with notes on the echo lens. He laid them out before Elias, watching as his old acquaintance scanned the designs, his expression shifting from curiosity to something far more intense. This, Elias muttered, tapping one of the sketches. This is either complete lunacy or the most ambitious thing I've ever seen. Kale leaned forward. It's the latter, and I need your help. Elias sighed, rubbing his chin. Do you have any idea what you're asking for? This isn't some garage project. The kind of tech you need. Quantum processors, neural interfaces, raw data feeds. We're talking millions in development costs. Kale clenched his jaw. I don't need millions. I need a chance. A long silence stretched between them before Elias finally spoke. All right, I'll get you a space in the off-books lab. But if this turns out to be a waste of my time, don't expect a second favor. Kale nodded, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum. Tomorrow, the echo lens would begin to take form. Chapter 3, Shadows of Doubt. Kale's fingers drummed against the cold metal of the workstation, the hum of Synapse Labs' hidden research floor filling his ears. The space Elias had secured for him was impressive, more than he could have ever hoped for. The sterile white walls were lined with advanced equipment, the kind that only the most well-funded institutions had access to. It was the perfect place to begin building the echo lens. And yet, doubt gnawed at him. He'd spent his entire life plagued by a simple, unrelenting truth. Every idea he'd ever had was always thought of by someone else first. Even now, as he stared at the schematics, he couldn't shake the fear that somewhere, someone had already beaten him to it. Maybe there was already a secret government project researching the same concept. Maybe some startup on the other side of the world was a week away from unveiling the same technology. Lost in your head already? Elias's voice pulled Kale back to the present. The engineer leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him carefully. Kale sighed. What if this has already been done? Elias raised an eyebrow. You think I'd waste my time if it had? Kale hesitated. I don't know. Elias shook his head. You're smarter than that, Kale. If someone had already developed predictive cognitive processing at this level, the world would know. You wouldn't be sitting here right now. Kale wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that he had finally found his breakthrough, that the echo lens was something that only he could bring into existence. But years of failure had left scars, and they didn't fade overnight. All right, he said, exhaling. Let's get to work. Elias grinned. Now that's more like it. Kale pulled up his schematics and initiated the first build sequence. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he had something he'd never had before. A future worth fighting for. Chapter 4, Fractured Loyalties. Kale wiped the sweat from his brow as the Echo Lens prototype flickered to life for the first time. The holographic interface glowed in the dimly lit lab, casting eerie shadows across the workstation. The reality of his creation was no longer just an abstract concept, it was real, tangible, and dangerously close to being operational. Elias stood behind him, arms crossed. That's it, he asked, his voice edged with skepticism. You sure it's working? Kale exhaled slowly. It's booting up, but we need to calibrate the neural interface. The real test is whether it can actually project predictive pathways. Elias nodded, but there was something guarded in his expression. You realize what this means if it works, right? This isn't just some experiment, Kale. This can change everything. Kale met his gaze. That's the point. A heavy silence fell between them before Elias sighed. I hope you know what you're doing. The door to the lab slid open suddenly, and Sarah Cade strode in, her movements precise, her expression unreadable. We have a problem, she announced, holding up a tablet. There's chatter about a corporate buyout of Synapse Labs. Someone's making moves to take control. If they find out what we're working on. Kale's stomach clenched. We're running out of time. Elias rubbed his temples. Then we need to decide now. Do we see this through, or do we pull the plug before someone else does? Kale stared at the glowing projection of the Echo Lens, the future literally flickering before him. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 5. The Point of No Return. Kale's pulse hammered in his ears as he stared at the echo lens, its faint glow illuminating the dim lab. The weight of what he had created pressed against his chest, an invisible force demanding he recognize the magnitude of his work. He had spent his life chasing originality, desperate to contribute something new to the world. Now that he had, it felt less like a victory and more like a sentence. Elias broke the silence first. If we don't act fast, we're going to lose control of this. Synapse Labs is already under surveillance. If we wait too long, someone else will decide what happens next. Kale nodded but couldn't find his voice. The thought of his invention being taken from him, twisted into something beyond his intent, made his stomach churn. He glanced at Sarah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. She met his gaze, her dark eyes steady and assessing. "You're not hesitating, are you?" "No," Kale said quickly. Too quickly. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her himself. Elias exhaled sharply. "Then we move. Tonight, we extract the core data and take it off-site. We burn everything else." Sarah gave a curt nod. "I'll handle security. But once we do this, we're on our own. There's no undoing it." Kale forced himself to take a deep breath. He had spent his entire life searching for purpose, for something that made him more than just an echo of others' ideas. Now, standing on the precipice of something bigger than himself, he realized this was it. They were crossing a threshold. There was no turning back. Kale's mind raced as he sifted through the data files stored within the echo lens. Every equation, every predictive model was now at his fingertips, and yet the weight of their significance bore down on him like a crushing tide. He had always imagined that the moment of his greatest breakthrough would be a triumphant one, filled with exhilaration. Instead, it was suffocating. The knowledge that his creation could shape the course of human history, either as a force for good or as a tool of control, gnawed at the edges of his resolve. "We need to be careful about where we take this," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "That's an understatement," Elias replied, moving swiftly between computer terminals as he began downloading critical files onto an encrypted drive. "If the wrong people get their hands on this, we're talking about a level of surveillance and manipulation that makes everything before it look like child's play." Sarah, standing at the doorway, kept a watchful eye on the security feeds. "And I guarantee the wrong people are already looking. We have less time than you think." A tense silence filled the room as Kale processed her words. He had spent years believing he was always too late, that every idea he conceived had already been discovered. But now, for the first time in his life, he was ahead. And being ahead meant being a target. "What happens if we fail?" Kale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't look up from his screen. "Then someone else succeeds. And that's not an option." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Kale's shoulders. He looked around the lab one last time, knowing this was the place where everything had changed. Where he had crossed from a man of ideas into a man of action. "Let's finish this," he said, steeling himself. The extraction process began. The encrypted drive filled with data, years of research, breakthrough algorithms, untold potential locked away in sequences of code. The lab was eerily quiet, save for the soft whir of the machines and the steady beeping of progress bars. Every moment stretched long and thin, the minutes feeling like hours as they waited for the final transfers to complete. Kale could feel the tension in the air, thick and unrelenting. He tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting to what would come next. Where would they go? Who could they trust? Every possibility led to more uncertainty. Then, an alert flashed across the screen. "Unauthorized access detected. Security override in progress." Sarah moved before anyone else could react, slamming her fist against the emergency lockdown panel. "They're already here. We need to go." "We're not done yet," Elias snapped, furiously typing commands to speed up the data transfer. "We don't have time," Sarah shot back. Kale's hands clenched into fists. He knew they had seconds, maybe a minute at most, before security stormed the lab. He glanced at the echo lens, the device that had brought them to this point. The culmination of his life's work, glowing faintly in the low light, so deceptively small compared to the chaos it had caused. There was no more room for doubt. No more room for hesitation. Kale grabbed the drive, yanked the lens from its dock, and turned toward the exit. "Move, now." Elias and Sarah followed, sprinting into the dimly lit corridors as the lab's alarms blared behind them. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the distance. They weren't just running for their lives now. They were running for the future. Chapter 6. Flight into Darkness. The hallway pulsed with red emergency lights as Kale, Elias, and Sarah sprinted toward the exit. The alarm screamed in their ears, a constant reminder that their time had run out. Every footstep echoed through the sleek, metallic corridors, their pursuers close behind. Kale's chest burned as he forced himself to keep moving. The echo lens was secured in his grip, and the encrypted drive was tucked safely inside his coat. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Dark figures in tactical gear were closing in fast. Elias cursed under his breath. How did they get here so fast? Sarah didn't break stride. We were naive to think we had more time. They've probably been watching us for weeks. The reinforced security doors loomed ahead. If they could get through them, they had a chance of making it out. Elias skidded to a stop at the terminal beside the door, fingers flying across the holographic interface. Keep them off me for 30 seconds, he barked. Sarah spun around, drawing her sidearm. 30 seconds is a long time. Kale crouched behind a console, gripping the echo lens tighter. His heart pounded as he heard boots pounding against the floor, closer and closer. Sarah fired, the sharp crack of gunfire ringing through the air. Elias swore again. They're overriding my clearance. I need another minute. Kale's mind raced. He had spent years feeling one step behind, but not anymore. His invention had the power to predict possible outcomes, perhaps even this moment. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing his mind to focus. A surge of fragmented images flashed through his consciousness. Sarah pivoting, firing 3 precise shots. Elias dodging just as a bullet shattered the console beside him. The security doors opening, just in time. Kale's eyes snapped open. Sarah, shoot left. Without hesitation, she fired in the direction he called out. A pained shout echoed from the hallway. A moment later, Elias yanked the panel open. Got it, move. The security doors groaned as they slid apart. Kale dashed through first, Elias and Sarah right behind him. They emerged onto the rooftop, the cold night air biting against Kale's sweat-drenched skin. A helipad stretched before them, but there was no helicopter. Instead, a single black motorcycle stood waiting. Elias gaped. That's your escape plan? Sarah didn't hesitate. No choice. Kale, get on. He swung his leg over the seat, Sarah climbing on behind him. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second before grabbing onto the back. The door behind them burst open. Go, 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 Elias shouted. Kale twisted the throttle, and the bike roared to life. Tires screeched as they sped toward the edge of the rooftop. The only way down was a narrow maintenance ramp leading to the street below. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete as they raced down the incline, wind whipping past them. Kale gritted his teeth, keeping his grip tight on the handlebars. One wrong move and they'd be street splatter. Sarah leaned in. Head toward the river. We need to disappear. Kale nodded, pushing the bike to its limits. The city stretched out before them, a labyrinth of neon and steel. The chase was far from over, but for the first time, they had a chance. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting to survive. The streets were a blur as Kale weaved through traffic, the roar of the engine drowning out the distant wail of sirens. Behind him, Sarah kept an eye on their pursuers. 3 vehicles. Black SUVs. They're gaining. Elias clung tightly to the back of the bike, his knuckles white. We need to lose them before they box us in. Kale's mind raced, filtering through possible escape routes. The river wasn't far, but they needed to shake their tail first. He cut through a narrow alleyway, narrowly avoiding a stack of crates. The SUVs screeched to a halt behind them, momentarily blocked. Nice move, Elias muttered, but Kale wasn't celebrating yet. They burst out onto a larger avenue, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Traffic was light, but the SUVs had recovered and were back on their tail. One of them pulled up alongside them, a masked gunman leaning out the window. Hold on, Kale shouted, swerving hard to the right just as a burst of gunfire erupted. The bullets sprayed harmlessly against a parked car, but they were running out of room. Sarah pulled her own firearm, steadying herself against Kale's back. Keep it steady. She took a deep breath and fired. The gunman jerked back, his weapon flying from his hands as he slumped against the window. The SUV swerved wildly before slamming into a light post. "One down," Sarah muttered. "Two to go," Elias reminded them. Cale spotted the on-ramp to the bridge ahead. If they could make it across, they'd have a clear shot to the river and could vanish into the industrial district. "Hang on," he warned again, gunning the throttle. The bike surged forward, the remaining SUVs struggling to keep up. The bridge loomed ahead, but Cale could see the flashing lights of a roadblock at the other end. Elias cursed. "They're cutting us off." Cale gritted his teeth. They had one option left. He swerved sharply, cutting across an empty side lane leading to a maintenance stairwell that spiraled down toward the lower levels of the bridge structure. It was a gamble, but it was the only way out. "Brace yourselves," he called as they hurtled toward the narrow path. As they plunged downward, the roar of the pursuing SUVs faded behind them. For now, they had escaped. But Cale knew the fight was far from over. Chapter 7. Beneath the Surface. Cale's grip tightened on the handlebars as they wove through the maze of rusted steel and cracked concrete beneath the bridge. The tires skidded on the damp pavement as they narrowly avoided the remnants of forgotten construction materials. The roar of their pursuers above had faded into a distant hum, but Cale knew they weren't safe yet. Elias shifted uncomfortably behind him. "Where exactly are we going? Because if this is a dead end, I'm going to be very unhappy." Sarah tapped Cale's shoulder and pointed ahead. "Down that tunnel." The path led into a massive storm drain, its entrance hidden by overgrown weeds and collapsed fencing. Cale hesitated for only a moment before revving the throttle and plunging into the darkness. The air grew cooler as the tunnel walls closed around them, the echo of the motorcycle's engine bouncing off the slick concrete. "This better not be a trap," Elias muttered. Sarah shot him a sharp look. "Would you rather be up there getting riddled with bullets?" Elias sighed but said nothing. The tunnel stretched on for what felt like miles before opening into a vast underground chamber. Stagnant water pooled along the edges of the space, reflecting the dim glow of distant maintenance lights. Abandoned machinery and rusted pipes lined the walls, remnants of an old water treatment facility long forgotten by the city above. Cale slowed the bike to a stop, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "We'll be safe here, for now," Sarah said, sliding off the bike. "This place isn't on any official maps. It's been off the grid for years." Elias climbed off, stretching his legs. "Great, so now we're hiding in a sewer. This just keeps getting better." Cale ignored the sarcasm and dismounted, his eyes scanning the darkened expanse. The echo lens pulsed faintly in his pocket, a reminder of the power they carried, and the danger that followed them. "We need a plan," he said. "Hiding won't be enough. We have to find out who's after us and why." Sarah nodded. "Agreed. But first, let's check our gear and make sure we're not walking into another ambush." As they prepared to regroup, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The underground was supposed to be abandoned, but in the shadows, something stirred. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Dark. The air in the underground chamber was thick with the scent of damp metal and stagnant water. Cale shifted uncomfortably, his eyes scanning the vast, abandoned space. The remnants of rusted machinery lined the walls like forgotten relics, their surfaces glistening under the dim emergency lights that flickered overhead. He clenched his jaw, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. Elias tapped his shoulder. "We're not alone." Cale turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving to the echo lens strapped to his belt. Sarah had already drawn her weapon, her sharp eyes trained on the shadows. The underground was supposed to be abandoned, but the faint sound of shuffling feet echoed in the distance, barely discernible over the quiet drip of water from corroded pipes. Sarah took a cautious step forward, her voice low. "Whoever's here knows we are too. We need to move." Cale's grip tightened on the echo lens. He had spent years designing it, building it, shaping it into the tool that now made him a target. And now, trapped beneath the city, he had no idea whether it would save them or doom them all. Elias exhaled slowly. Options. Sarah pointed to a series of rusted catwalks overhead. "We get higher ground, use it to our advantage. If they're armed, we don't want to be caught in the open." Cale nodded and led the way toward the nearest ladder, the metal ice cold beneath his fingers. As he climbed, his mind raced. Who was after them? What did they know? And how much time did they have before the next move was out of their hands? A sudden sound, louder this time. A deliberate scrape of metal against concrete. Sarah froze. They're closer. Elias swallowed hard. Then we better be ready. In the darkness, something moved. The catwalk groaned under Cale's weight as he reached the top. The metal was rusted and unstable, but it offered a better vantage point. From here, he could see the full scope of the underground chamber, a vast industrial relic of a bygone era, pipes winding along the walls, staircases leading to unknown depths. More importantly, he spotted movement below. Two figures, both clad in dark tactical gear, moving in perfect synchronization. Sarah pulled herself up next to him and whispered, "Professionals." Cale's pulse quickened. "How do you know?" "Their stance, the way they move. This isn't some street gang looking for an easy payday. Someone sent them." Elias positioned himself behind an overturned piece of machinery. "And we still don't know why." Cale fought back a wave of frustration. He had assumed they were after the echo lens, but if they were professionals, they had to know it wasn't just a valuable piece of tech, it was something far more dangerous in the wrong hands. The figures below stopped. One of them raised a hand, signaling something to unseen allies. Then, almost simultaneously, both lifted their weapons and aimed upward. "Get down," Cale shouted. Gunfire erupted, bullets pinging off the metal catwalk. Cale and the others hit the deck, rolling behind the nearest cover. The sound of ricocheting rounds filled the air, sending sparks flying into the darkness. "They knew we'd take the high ground," Sarah gritted out. "They're funneling us." Cale's mind raced. He wasn't a soldier, he was a scientist. But his creation had given him something few people had, foresight. He shut his eyes, focusing on the echo lens. He didn't have time to properly calibrate it, but even a fraction of a second's glimpse into the next few moments could save their lives. A fractured vision burst into his mind. Sarah rolling left, narrowly avoiding a shot. Elias finding a hatch, a way down. Cale jumping just in time, avoiding a bullet meant for his chest. His eyes snapped open. "Left, now," he barked. Sarah didn't hesitate. She rolled just as a bullet shattered the beam behind where she had been crouching. Elias spotted the hatch Cale had seen in his vision and sprinted toward it. "This way." Cale leapt, his breath catching in his throat as a round whizzed past where he had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. He hit the ground hard, pain jolting up his arms, but he ignored it, scrambling toward Elias. Sarah reached the hatch first, yanking it open. "Down, now." One by one, they dropped into the unknown, leaving their attackers behind. As Cale's boots hit the ground, he took a shaky breath and looked around. They were in another underground chamber, smaller but even more decrepit. Pipes hissed steam into the air, and pools of murky water reflected the dim emergency lights. The air smelled of rust and something else, something chemical. Elias coughed. "Where are we now?" Cale wiped sweat from his brow. "I have no idea, but at least we're not dead." Sarah pulled out a flashlight and shone it forward. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a rusted sign bolted to the wall. The faded lettering sent a chill through Cale's spine. "Restricted Zone, Level 3 Biohazard Containment." Elias groaned. "Oh, that's just perfect." Cale's mind whirled with questions. How had a containment zone ended up beneath the city? More importantly, why had their pursuers chased them straight into it? Sarah turned to Cale, her expression grim. "You need to use the lens again. We need to know what we just walked into." Cale nodded, gripping the device tightly. He took a deep breath and activated it once more. The visions came fast, too fast. Flickering images of empty corridors, shadows moving behind glass, a presence lurking just out of reach. And then, a door opening, a shape emerging from the darkness, and something looking directly at him. Cale gasped and stumbled back, his pulse hammering. Whatever was in here with them, it had seen him first. Chapter 9. The Awakening Below. Cale's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he staggered backward, the echo lens still buzzing in his grip. The vision had been clearer than any before, but it left behind a lingering dread that seeped into his bones. Whatever was down here, it wasn't just watching them, it had been waiting. Elias gave him a sharp look. "Cale, what did you see?" Cale struggled to form words. "Something, alive, moving, I don't know what, but it knew I was looking at it." Sarah swore under her breath and tightened her grip on her weapon. "We need to keep moving." If this is really a containment zone, there's a reason for it. And I don't want to find out the hard way. Elias turned, shining his flashlight down the corridor. The concrete walls were lined with rusted metal pipes, some of them hissing with leaking steam. The stench of decay hung thick in the air, making Cale's stomach churn. A sound echoed through the space, a deep, guttural growl that sent a chill through all three of them. "That's not human," Elias muttered. Cale steadied himself, forcing his fear aside. "Then let's hope it doesn't find us first." They pressed forward, stepping cautiously over puddles of stagnant water. The air was thick, humid, and carried an underlying metallic tang that made Cale's skin crawl. He could hear Elias's breathing, steady but tense, and Sarah's footfalls, light, calculated, always ready to react. "You never did tell me how you ended up in this mess," Elias said, his voice hushed but probing. Cale hesitated, his mind flashing back to years before, when he was just a kid in a small, windowless lab, his father's voice a constant presence behind him, instructing, correcting, criticizing. "I was raised for this kind of thing. Science, tech, innovation. My father pushed it into me before I even knew what childhood was supposed to be. I never had playdates, never had free weekends. Just experiments, equations, and expectations." Elias gave a dry chuckle. "Sounds familiar. My old man was in the military. Never let me slack off for even a second. If I wasn't running drills, I was learning strategy. Tactics. You don't get to be soft when you're the son of a soldier." Cale smirked despite himself. "So basically, we both had childhoods we didn't ask for." "Pretty much," Elias admitted. "And Sarah, what about you?" Sarah kept her eyes fixed ahead, scanning every shadowed corner. "I don't talk about my past." Cale raised an eyebrow. "Come on, we just spilled our tragic backstories. Fair's fair." Sarah sighed. "Fine, I didn't grow up in a lab, and I wasn't trained by a soldier. I grew up on the streets. I learned to fend for myself early on. No one handed me anything. No safety nets, no lectures about how to be better. I learned survival the hard way." Elias nodded slowly. "And now we're all here. Different roads, same destination." Before Cale could reply, another growl, this time closer. A deep, guttural vibration in the air, coming from somewhere beyond the next bend. Sarah raised her weapon. "We need to move faster." Cale adjusted the echo lens. The vibrations of the entity ahead felt like static running through his skull. He took a steadying breath and activated the device. A rush of images surged through his mind, flickering visions of something hunched, waiting, breathing. And then, its head snapped up. Cale's pulse spiked. "It knows we're here." The shadows ahead twisted as something enormous began to move toward them. Chapter 10. Descent into Fear. The air grew colder as the massive shape moved in the shadows, its presence an oppressive force pressing down on them. Cale's heart pounded against his ribs as he tried to steady his breathing. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt rooted in place. The echo lens pulsed in his grip, but he was too afraid to activate it again. Sarah gritted her teeth, adjusting her grip on her weapon. "We need to get out of here. Now." Elias took a step closer to Cale. "Can you see a way out? Use the lens." Cale hesitated. The last vision had nearly paralyzed him with fear. But they had no choice. He closed his eyes and focused, the echo lens humming in response. The world around him fractured into fleeting glimpses of possible outcomes. A tunnel to the left, narrow, but clear. Elias pulling Cale forward as the creature lunges. Sarah firing at something massive, its eyes glowing in the dark. Cale's eyes snapped open. Left. There's a passage. Move. They bolted, their footsteps echoing through the underground maze. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows thickening around them. A low, guttural hiss rattled through the chamber, sending a shiver up Cale's spine. Whatever was back there wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let them leave easily. Sarah glanced back, her face tight with focus. "It's following. Keep running." They reached the tunnel just as a deafening roar shook the chamber. The walls trembled, dust and debris raining down on them. Cale felt Elias grab his arm, yanking him through the narrow opening just as something massive crashed behind them, blocking the way they had come. Gasping for breath, they pressed deeper into the darkness. The passage sloped downward, the air turning stale. They had escaped, for now. But Cale knew this wasn't over. Elias wiped sweat from his brow. What was that thing? Kale swallowed hard, gripping the echo lens. Something we were never supposed to see. And I don't think it was the only one. Sarah exhaled sharply. Then we better keep moving. Because if that thing knows we're here, others might, too. They shared a silent glance, their fears unspoken but understood. There was no turning back now. Whatever secrets this place held, they were about to uncover them, whether they wanted to or not. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Depths. The tunnel stretched before them, a seemingly endless passage descending into darkness. The walls dripped with condensation, the faint scent of mildew and rust thick in the air. Kale's boots splashed through shallow puddles as he kept pace with Elias and Sarah. His fingers tightened around the echo lens, the device feeling heavier than ever in his grasp. Sarah cast a glance behind them, her face taut with tension. I don't hear it anymore. Elias shook his head. That doesn't mean it's gone. Just means it's waiting. Kale exhaled slowly, his pulse still thrumming from their escape. We need to figure out what this place is. There has to be a reason that thing is down here. Elias motioned ahead. Only one way to find out. Keep moving. The passage narrowed, forcing them to walk in a single file line. Overhead, rusted pipes crisscrossed like veins, some leaking a viscous black substance that dripped onto the floor. The deeper they went, the more the air grew thick with something unplaceable, an unnatural stillness that set Kale's nerves on edge. Sarah ran a hand along the wall, brushing away grime to reveal faded lettering. Containment wing B-12. She turned to Kale. This wasn't just a containment area. It was part of something bigger. Kale's mind raced. A research facility. A military installation. Elias gave a grim nod. Maybe both. But the real question is, what were they trying to contain? As if in answer, a distant metallic clang echoed through the corridor, the sound bouncing off the walls in an eerie cacophony. Sarah instantly raised her weapon, Elias following suit. Kale adjusted the echo lens, hesitating only for a moment before activating it. Images surged through his mind. Rows of glass chambers, their contents obscured by frost. Flickering overhead lights, revealing grotesque shapes suspended in liquid. A control panel, flashing red with warnings Kale couldn't read fast enough. His breath hitched as the final vision came into focus. A figure standing motionless ahead of them, its eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. Kale's throat went dry. We're not alone. Elias and Sarah followed his gaze. Just beyond the next bend, a shadow stirred, the faintest shift of movement breaking the impressive silence. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an unspoken threat. Sarah whispered, whatever's down here, it was never meant to be found. Kale tightened his grip on the echo lens and took a step forward. Then we better find out why. As they crept forward, the figure in the darkness moved. A rustling sound, slow and deliberate, echoed down the corridor. Then, without warning, a woman emerged from the shadows. Sarah jerked her weapon up. Who are you? The woman raised her hands slowly, palms outward. Her long black hair was damp, sticking to her pale face. She was dressed in tattered, dark clothing that seemed too thin for the freezing underground temperatures. Her piercing green eyes darted between them, assessing. You don't want to be here, she said, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. Elias tightened his grip on his weapon. No kidding. Who are you? How did you get down here? She hesitated, her gaze flicking down the corridor as if expecting something to emerge behind her. My name is Leora, and if you don't leave soon, none of us will. Kale frowned. That's not an answer. Leora exhaled sharply, lowering her arms but staying tense. I was part of the research team. A long time ago, I was trapped down here when everything fell apart. Sarah narrowed her eyes. How long ago? Leora swallowed. I don't know. Months. Years, maybe. Time blurs when you're fighting to survive. Kale studied her carefully, but something about her wasn't adding up. You were a scientist. Leora's expression hardened. Something like that. What Kale and the others didn't know was that Leora had been one of the lead researchers in Project Echo, the same experiment that had led to the creation of the Echo lens. But she wasn't here by accident. She had been left behind deliberately. Leora had been one of the few who had realized the dangers of what they had been creating. The moment they activated the containment protocols, she had fought to shut it all down. But But she had failed. The facility had been sealed, and she had been locked inside with the nightmares they had unleashed. And now, as she stood before Kale, Elias, and Sarah, she knew that history was repeating itself. She had one chance to stop it. The question was, would they believe her in time? Chapter 12. The Lies Between Us. The silence between them was as thick as the suffocating air of the underground chamber. Leora's piercing green eyes flicked between the three of them, as if searching for some crack in their resolve, some sign that she could manipulate or use. Kale wasn't sure if it was fear or instinct that made him hesitate, but something about her didn't feel right. Elias kept his gun steady, his knuckles white. You said you were part of the research team. If that's true, tell us exactly what was being contained here. No riddles, no half-truths. We're done playing games. Leora's lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. You think you're ready for that answer? I don't believe you are. Sarah stepped forward, her voice low but laced with warning. Try us. Leora exhaled through her nose, as if she had already decided they weren't worth her time, but relenting just enough to humor them. Project Echo wasn't just about research. It wasn't just about discovery. It was about control. Control over thought, control over time, control over possibility itself. You think your Echo lens is the first iteration of its kind? Kale's grip on the device tightened. What do you mean? Leora tilted her head slightly, her tangled black hair shifting over her pale face. You're carrying a prototype of something much bigger. Something they tried to perfect here. And when they failed, they tried to bury it. Elias let out a bitter chuckle. Bury it? You mean bury you? For the first time, Leora's expression darkened, shadows pooling in the hollows beneath her sharp cheekbones. They didn't just bury me. They buried the truth. And if you stay here long enough, you'll find out why no one was supposed to leave this place alive. Kale's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe she was lying. He wanted to believe that she was just another desperate survivor spinning stories in the dark to keep herself relevant. But the way she said it, the way her voice dropped like an anchor into something deeper, he knew she wasn't bluffing. Sarah took another step forward, her eyes narrowing. And what exactly are you still doing here? If this place is so dangerous, why haven't you left? Leora's lips parted, but no words came immediately. A muscle in her jaw twitched, and Kale saw something flicker behind her eyes. Hesitation, vulnerability, just for a moment before she buried it beneath that sharp, unreadable gaze. Because someone has to make sure it stays buried. And if you're here, then you've already begun to dig too deep. A noise broke the standoff, a distant clatter of metal against concrete, followed by a deep, reverberating groan that seemed to crawl through the walls. The sound of something waking up. Leora's head snapped toward the noise. When she turned back to them, all traces of arrogance were gone. If you want to live, stop asking questions and start running. Now. Kale exchanged a look with Elias and Sarah. In that split second, they had a choice to make. Trust her, or take their chances with whatever was lurking in the dark. And there was no time left to hesitate. Chapter 13. Into the Abyss. The sound that echoed through the chamber was unlike anything Kale had ever heard. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure, vibration, something that reached into his bones and rattled them from the inside out. The low, guttural groan seemed to pulse through the walls, the pipes, even the stagnant air around them. Sarah swore under her breath. That's close, too close. Elias shifted his stance, his gun still trained on Leora. You expect us to trust you just because you're scared of the dark like we are. Leora's face remained impassive, but her green eyes flashed with something deeper. You can trust me, or you can die here trying to figure out if you should have. Your choice. Kale's grip on the echo lens tightened. We don't have time for this. Another sound, this time, closer. A scraping, like claws against metal, reverberated through the tunnel. Kale's stomach clenched. Leora turned sharply, her expression shifting from warning to full-fledged urgency. Go, now. Kale moved first, trusting instinct over logic. Elias and Sarah exchanged a final glance before falling in behind him. Leora took the lead, moving with surprising speed and certainty, as if she had memorized every turn, every blind corner. There's a maintenance hatch ahead, she whispered over her shoulder. If we reach it before that thing finds us, we might stand a chance. Kale didn't like the word might in that sentence. The corridor floor twisted, narrowing with each step, the oppressive air thickening. The wet floor made it impossible to move silently, every hurried step a splash against the stagnant puddles. Somewhere behind them, the groaning sound deepened, like something exhaling a breath that had been held for centuries. Sarah pressed forward, her breath coming in sharp bursts. What exactly are we running from? Leora didn't look back, something that should have never been woken up. Cale's pulse pounded in his ears as the hatch finally came into view, a rusted metal wheel set into the wall. Leora lunged forward and twisted it with practiced ease, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, now. Cale slipped through first, his foot catching on the edge of a slick step as he stumbled into the darkness beyond. Elias was next, then Sarah. Leora followed last, yanking the hatch shut behind her just as something massive slammed against it from the other side. The force rattled the walls, sending dust and debris cascading from above. The hatch groaned, but it held, for now. Cale pushed himself upright, his breathing ragged. We need to keep moving. Leora nodded, pressing her ear against the metal for a moment before stepping back. This isn't over, it's just beginning. Somehow, Cale had already known that. Chapter 14, The Depths of Deception. The air in the narrow passage was thick with the scent of rust and decay. Cale pressed his back against the cold metal wall, his breath still unsteady. The pounding against the hatch had stopped, but an eerie silence had settled over them, heavier than the darkness itself. Elias wiped a streak of sweat from his brow. Tell me again why we're trusting her. Leora shot him a sharp look. Because you don't have a better option. Sarah exhaled slowly, keeping her weapon raised. What's ahead? Where does this passage lead? Leora hesitated. It was slight, just a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but Cale caught it. You don't know, do you? He said quietly. Leora's jaw tightened. I know it leads deeper. And deeper is the only way forward. Cale exchanged glances with Elias and Sarah. None of them liked this, but turning back wasn't an option. Whatever was behind that hatch wasn't going to wait for them to make a decision. Leora turned, leading them through the passage, her footsteps impossibly light on the damp floor. The tunnel sloped downward, the air becoming colder with every step. The wall dripped with condensation, and the dim emergency lights flickered as if sensing their presence. Elias kept his voice low. So, Leora, if you were one of the researchers here, tell us, what were you really working on? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was distant. Project Echo was supposed to be about prediction. Understanding possibilities before they happened. But we didn't stop at observation. We pushed further. We tried to control it. Cale's grip tightened on the Echo lens. And you failed. Leora stopped walking. Slowly, she turned to face him. No, we succeeded, and that's the problem. A chill ran through Cale, deeper than the cold air around them. Sarah shifted, clearly uneasy. What do you mean? Leora looked past them, into the darkness beyond. You're about to find out. Before they could respond, a sound echoed from ahead. A whisper, low and insidious, curling through the passage like smoke. And then the lights went out. Chapter 15, The Whispering Void. Darkness swallowed them whole. Cale's breath came shallow and sharp, his fingers instinctively tightening around the Echo lens. The oppressive silence after the whisper was worse than any sound. It was as if the tunnel itself was waiting for them to make a move. Sarah's voice broke the void, barely a whisper. Everyone still here? Yeah, Elias murmured, but I'm not sure for how long. Cale closed his eyes and focused, letting the Echo lens pulse in his grasp. It was useless in complete darkness. Visions of the future required at least some sensory input, but he could feel something shifting around them. Not movement. Not sound, just something. Then Leora's voice came, soft but urgent. We need to move, now. And go where, exactly? Elias snapped. I can't see a thing. Forward, she replied, already starting ahead. The whisper wasn't random. Something is here, and it knows we are, too. Cale swallowed hard. His instincts screamed to hold back, to analyze the situation, but a deep unease slithered down his spine. Leora knew something. And if she was afraid, they had every reason to be. They moved carefully, hands brushing against damp walls, footsteps muffled on the slick floor. Every few seconds, Cale thought he heard something, a soft breath, the rustle of fabric just out of reach, but when he stopped to listen, there was nothing. whisper returned, right next to his ear. Run. Panic ignited in his chest. Move, now. They broke into a sprint, blind but desperate. The passage sloped downward, the air growing colder with every step. A sudden burst of static hissed through the echo lens, making Cale flinch. Then, as suddenly as the darkness had come, a faint glow appeared ahead, pale and sickly, seeping through the cracks of a massive steel door. Leora reached it first, her breath ragged. We have to go through. Elias hesitated. What if what we're running from is on the other side? Leora turned to them, her green eyes flashing in the dim light. Then we'll have to decide if it's better than what's behind us. Cale reached for the door handle, pulse hammering. The whisper returned, one last time, curling against his ear like cold fingers. You shouldn't have come. He yanked the door open. A wave of freezing air rushed past them as the door groaned on rusted hinges. The glow inside came from thin, flickering emergency lights that barely illuminated the vast chamber beyond. It was a control room, or at least it had been, before time and abandonment had turned it into a graveyard of dead monitors and broken consoles. The walls were lined with shattered glass panels, the remains of observation windows that once peered into whatever horrors this facility had contained. Sarah stepped in first, sweeping her weapon across the room. Clear, but something's not right. Cale followed, his boots crunching over shattered glass. This place hasn't been touched in years. So why does it feel like it's waiting for us? Leora moved with eerie familiarity, running her hands over the rusted control panels. Because it is. Elias frowned. What do you mean? Leora exhaled slowly, then pressed a button on the nearest console. A deep mechanical groan echoed from the walls as the remaining monitors flickered to life. Grainy, static-filled images filled the screens, hallways just like the ones they had come through, but something was wrong. Shadows moved unnaturally, shifting when no one was there. Then, one by one, the cameras started shutting off. Cale took a step back. Something is wiping the feeds. Sarah's grip on her gun tightened. Something knows we're here. A single monitor remained active. Unlike the others, it didn't show the hallways. It showed the room they were standing in. And in the far corner of the screen, barely visible in the flickering light, a shadow detached itself from the wall. Cale spun around just as a deep, rattling breath filled the air behind them. Run, Leora whispered, but this time, it was too late. Chapter 16, The Shadow That Watches. The breath was ice against Cale's skin, a deathly whisper curling through the stagnant air. His body tensed, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs felt weighted as if something unseen had wrapped around them. The others froze beside him, their eyes locked onto the shadow detaching itself from the far corner of the room. Leora was the first to react. Move, now. Her voice cracked through the heavy silence like a gunshot. Sarah fired. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for the briefest of moments, revealing the shifting form in the darkness. The bullet hit, but the shadow didn't react. Instead, it slithered forward, impossibly fast, flickering as if it existed between moments of time itself. Elias grabbed Cale's arm, yanking him back toward the corridor they had entered from. We have to go. Leora had already reached the door controls, but the rusted mechanisms groaned in protest. The steel door slammed shut just as the shadow lunged, its featureless mass striking the barrier with a soundless impact. For a moment, silence. Then, the temperature in the room dropped. Cale could see his breath fogging the air. The echo lens vibrated in his palm, the frequencies shifting erratically. He swallowed hard, struggling to steady his thoughts. What is that thing? Leora leaned against the wall, pressing a hand to her chest as she caught her breath. It's a remnant, a memory of something that should never have existed. Elias scoffed. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting, Leora shot back, her voice sharp. We need to find another exit before it finds another way in. Sarah examined the room, her eyes scanning for any sign of an escape. There, she pointed toward a ventilation shaft, its cover partially rusted through. It's tight, but we can squeeze through. Cale didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in a few strides, gripping the edge of the cover and wrenching it free with a metallic screech. The tunnel beyond was narrow, but it stretched away into the unknown. Anywhere was better than here. Go, Elias urged, shoving Cale forward. He crawled inside, the metal cold beneath his palms and knees. Behind him, he could hear the others scrambling in, one by one. like smoke. I see you. Panic overtook him, and he lunged forward, crawling faster. The others followed, their breathing ragged in the confined space. The vent sloped downward, the shadows stretching deeper than Kale wanted to acknowledge. There was no turning back now. Chapter 17, Descent into Madness. Kale's palms were slick with sweat as he crawled forward through the narrow vent, the metal biting into his knees. The whisper still echoed in his ears, tendrils of its sound curling around his thoughts like vines seeking to root themselves in his mind. He clenched his jaw, shaking his head as if he could physically rid himself of its presence. Behind him, Elias muttered a curse under his breath. Keep moving. I don't want to find out if that thing can squeeze through here. Leora, directly behind Elias, breathed heavily. It doesn't need to. If it wanted to, it would already be in here with us. Kale swallowed hard, not daring to ask what she meant. Sarah was last in line, keeping an eye on their escape route, her movements precise and controlled. The vent sloped downward suddenly, sending Kale sliding faster than he intended. He grunted, trying to slow himself, but the smooth metal offered little resistance. He landed hard on a grated platform, the impact sending a sharp pain up his arm. Elias landed beside him a second later, rolling to absorb the fall. Leora followed, wincing as she hit the platform. Sarah was the last to drop, landing on her feet with feline grace. Kale pushed himself up, rubbing his shoulder as he took in their surroundings. They were in a dimly lit maintenance bay, the air thick with the scent of oil and something more acrid, something burnt. The room was lined with rusted machinery, old control panels blinking sporadically as if they were trying to stay alive. Where are we? Elias asked, stepping forward cautiously. Leora walked past him, her fingers trailing over a panel as she read the faded text beneath. Sub-level 5, we're beneath the primary containment zone now. Sarah narrowed her eyes. And why does that sound like an even worse place to be? Leora hesitated, then turned to face them. Because whatever was locked away in this facility wasn't just meant to be contained. It was meant to be forgotten. And if we're here, we're closer to it than anyone has been in decades. Kale exhaled, his grip tightening around the echo lens. He had thought the worst was behind them, but now, in the belly of this place, he realized they had only just begun to scratch the surface of the nightmare they had stumbled into. Then, without warning, a distant scream shattered the silence. Leora's head snapped toward the sound, her expression shifting from guarded to alert. Did you hear that? She whispered. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. Yeah, we all did. Leora took a step forward, then another, her eyes darting between the shadows beyond the machinery. There's someone here. I saw them. Kale frowned. What? Where? She didn't answer. Instead, she took off, weaving between the rusted equipment, her footsteps echoing as she disappeared deeper into the maintenance bay. Dang it, Elias cursed, launching after her. Leora, stop. Kale and Sarah exchanged a quick glance before bolting after them. The bay was larger than it first seemed, a labyrinth of abandoned workstations, shattered glass, and exposed wiring hanging from the ceiling like the veins of some long-dead beast. Leora moved fast, her breath coming in short gasps. She skidded around a corner, knocking over a rusted toolbox that clattered loudly onto the floor. I saw them, she called back. Someone's here. Or something, Kale shouted, trying to keep up. You don't even know what you're chasing. Elias was gaining on her, reaching out just as she ducked around another corner. He barely managed to grab the back of her jacket, yanking her to a sudden stop. She twisted violently in his grip, her green eyes wild. Let me go. I saw them. We have to. We have to not get separated. Elias snapped, shaking her slightly. You take off like that again, and we leave you behind. Understood. Leora panted, her chest rising and falling, but something about the way she looked past him sent an involuntary shiver down Kale's spine. She wasn't afraid of them. She was afraid of what was behind them. Guys, Sarah's voice came, slow and controlled. We're not alone. Kale turned, and his breath hitched. The air seemed to ripple as a shadow moved at the edge of his vision, flickering, indistinct, like smoke refusing to take form. It lingered near the machinery, watching, waiting. Then it took a step forward. Chapter 18, Spectres in the Dark. Kale's pulse slammed against his ribs as the shadow moved, deliberate, soundless, its form shifting like smoke barely held together. He felt the weight of its gaze, though it had no discernible eyes. Leora stiffened in Elias's grip, her breath sharp. "That's it," she whispered. "That's what I saw. That's what's been watching us?" Sarah asked, tightening her hold on her weapon. Cale swallowed hard. "No, that's what's been waiting for us." The shadow pulsed, a ripple running through its form as if the air itself was bending around it. The temperature in the room plummeted. A deep, resonant hum filled the space, vibrating through Cale's chest like an unspoken warning. Then, in an instant, the shadow lunged. "Move," Elias bellowed. They scattered, diving behind rusted machinery and overturned workstations. The shadow slammed into the space they had just occupied, the impact sending a gust of icy wind through the bay. It retracted, reforming as though searching, sensing. Cale ducked behind a panel, his breath coming fast and shallow. He gripped the echo lens like a lifeline. "We can't fight that thing." "Then we run," Sarah shot back. Leora, crouched low behind an old generator, shook her head. "You don't outrun something like this. It's not bound by the same rules we are." Elias wiped sweat from his brow, trying to steady his nerves. "Then how do we stop it?" Leora hesitated, her fingers curling into fists. "We don't, but we can distract it." Before anyone could stop her, she bolted from cover, drawing the shadow's attention like a flame in the darkness. "Leora, no," Cale yelled, but she was already moving, weaving between the machinery as the shadow twisted toward her. It pulsed again, then shot forward, closing the gap between them in seconds. Cale felt panic claw at his throat. His mind raced, trying to think through the fear. He shut his eyes, activating the echo lens. A rush of fragmented images flooded his vision. Leora turning left. A collapsed section of the ceiling. A narrow opening leading deeper underground. His eyes snapped open. "There's a way out. 20 meters ahead. Leora, go left." She didn't hesitate. She veered left just as the shadow lunged, its form colliding with a row of rusted shelves. Metal screeched as debris rained down, momentarily disrupting the thing's shape. Elias, Sarah, and Cale sprinted after her. The opening was just ahead, a jagged crack in the facility's foundation, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Leora reached it first, sliding inside. Cale followed, feeling the walls scrape against his arms as he forced his way through. Sarah was next, then Elias. The second he slipped through, the shadow slammed into the entrance, sending shockwaves through the walls. The entire structure trembled. Then, silence. Cale's chest heaved as he turned, his eyes adjusting to the darkness of their new surroundings. The tunnel ahead sloped downward, disappearing into the abyss. Leora wiped the sweat from her forehead, her voice shaky but firm. "We keep going. There's no turning back now." Cale nodded. He wasn't sure if they had escaped the shadow, or if they had just stepped into something far worse. Chapter 19. The Abyss Stares Back. The tunnel stretched ahead like the throat of some ancient beast, yawning open and swallowing them whole. The darkness here was different, thicker, heavier. It wasn't just the absence of light, it felt alive, shifting around them in slow, deliberate waves. Cale shivered, gripping the echo lens tightly as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. Elias exhaled sharply. "Anyone else getting the feeling we just traded one nightmare for another?" Sarah adjusted her grip on her weapon. "We don't have a choice. We keep moving." Leora led the way, her footsteps disturbingly steady for someone who had just risked her life moments ago. Cale watched her closely. There was something about the way she carried herself down here, like she belonged in the dark. They moved carefully, their breaths shallow. The walls of the tunnel pulsed with unseen movement, just beyond the reach of their flashlights. It was subtle, like a shift in pressure, a barely audible whisper. Cale tried not to focus on it. Then, the tunnel changed. The smooth walls gave way to something rougher, jagged. The ground became uneven, scattered with debris. And then they saw it. A doorway. Rust-covered, half buried in the wall as if the earth itself had tried to consume it. Faded words were etched into the metal, barely legible under layers of grime and corrosion. Project Echo, Core Access. Cale's stomach tightened. This is it. This is where it all started. Elias glanced at him. Then this is where we find our answers. Leora hesitated for the first time since they entered the tunnel. Cale didn't miss the way her fingers twitched at her sides, or how her breathing slowed. Sarah stepped forward, pressing it against the rusted door. It's unlocked. Kale's pulse quickened. That's not necessarily a good thing. The air around them grew colder, the unseen whispers growing louder. Something was waiting beyond that door. And it knew they were coming. Just as Sarah reached for the handle, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural, pressing down on them like a suffocating force. A sudden shift in the air sent a chill down Kale's spine. Something had moved, not ahead, but behind them. He turned just in time to see Leora vanish. No sound, no struggle. One moment she was there, standing just behind Elias, and the next, she was gone. The darkness swallowed her whole. Leora, Kale's voice cracked as he whipped around, scanning the tunnel. Where did she? Elias swore under his breath, flicking his flashlight in every direction. That's not possible. We were watching her. Sarah had already drawn her weapon, eyes wide but steady. No, she said, voice low and tense. Something was watching us. A shadow lingered at the edges of their light, shifting unnaturally, retreating before they could fully see it. It hadn't come from the door ahead. It had been following them the whole time. Silent, patient. Kale took a slow step forward, barely breathing. Leora. Nothing. Only the oppressive darkness beyond, yawning like an abyss that had swallowed her whole. We have to go after her, he said, already moving toward where she had been. Elias grabbed his arm. Go after what? You saw what I saw. There was nothing. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone. Sarah scanned the area again, her expression unreadable. If we go looking for her, we might not come back either. Kale clenched his fists, his pulse hammering. We can't just leave her. Elias's voice was grim. We might not have a choice. Another whisper slithered through the air, but this time it was different. It wasn't behind them. It was inside the rusted door. And it was laughing. Chapter 20. The Doorway to Oblivion. The laugh wasn't human. It slithered through the air like oil, thick and slow, pressing into Kale's ears as though it had substance. It wasn't coming from just inside the door, it was coming from everywhere, curling around them, sinking into the walls, the floor, the air they breathed. Sarah shuddered, her grip tightening on her weapon. Tell me I'm not the only one who heard that. Oh, we all heard it, Elias muttered. He stepped forward and placed a tentative hand on the rusted door. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if the metal had been resting in the void of space. He pulled his fingers back quickly. I don't like this. Kale clenched the echo lens so tightly his knuckles turned white. Leora was gone, swallowed whole. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over again, looking for an answer. There had been nothing. No sound, no struggle. 1 second she had been there, the next. Gone. And now, whatever had taken her was waiting. We go in, Kale said, his voice steadier than he felt. Elias scoffed. Go in. Into the place that's laughing at us. That just erased Leora from existence. Kale turned to him, eyes hard. Do you have a better idea? Silence. Sarah exhaled through her nose. We don't leave without answers. Elias hesitated, then gave a tight nod. Fine, but if I see anything even resembling what took Leora, I'm shooting first and asking questions never. Kale stepped toward the door. The laugh had stopped, but the silence it left in its wake was worse. He reached out, fingers brushing the corroded handle. The second he touched it, everything changed. The tunnel behind them was gone. Not collapsed, not shrouded in darkness. Just gone. Where there had once been walls, there was now an infinite black void stretching beyond comprehension. It wasn't empty, it was less than empty, an absence so complete that it made Kale's head spin. He took an involuntary step back, his breath catching in his throat. Elias swore violently. What is this? Sarah reached out behind her, as if trying to feel for the space where the tunnel had once been. Her fingers meant nothing. This isn't real. It can't be real. Kale turned back to the door. The only thing left. The only way forward. The metal creaked as he pulled it open. Beyond it, a single corridor stretched into flickering light. And at the end of it, someone was waiting. The corridor pulsed with an eerie glow, its walls lined with twisted cables and half-functioning monitors that flickered between static and distorted images. The floor beneath them wasn't metal or stone, it felt soft, like flesh that gave slightly underfoot, sending a wave of nausea through Kale. Sarah's breath was shallow like it's alive. Cale fought against the rising panic in his chest. It doesn't matter. We keep moving. They stepped forward as a deep hum reverberated through the space, as if the corridor itself was breathing. The monitors on the walls shifted, images flickering across them, images of themselves. Cale stopped cold, his own pale face staring back at him from one of the screens, except it wasn't right. The image blinked, its eyes pure black. Sarah recoiled. That's not us. That's... Before she could finish, the entire corridor shuddered. A door at the far end slid open, and a figure stepped forward. A woman. Tall, gaunt, her body wrapped in tattered remnants of what had once been a lab coat. Her skin was stretched too tight, her eyes sunken into deep sockets that swallowed all light. But it was her mouth that was the worst, wide, stretched at the edges like something had forced it open far beyond its natural limit. She opened it further. And laughed. The same laugh that had been surrounding them all along. Cale stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. That's not possible. The woman took another step forward, her gaze fixed on them. And then, in a voice that scraped against reality itself, she spoke. You shouldn't have come here. Sarah fired without hesitation. The bullet struck her square in the chest, and passed straight through, vanishing as if swallowed by the air itself. The woman didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head. And smiled. Cale's heart slammed against his ribs. Run. But there was nowhere left to run. About the author, Anthony Smith. Anthony Smith is a visionary storyteller with a passion for blending science fiction, mystery, and self-development themes into gripping narratives. With a background in financial growth and personal development, Anthony believes that the best stories are the ones that leave you thinking long after the last page is turned. His work is dedicated to those who seek both thrilling adventures and deeper lessons in success, perseverance, and the pursuit of knowledge. Lessons from Visions of Deception. Beyond the mystery and suspense, this book carries deeper themes about the power of foresight, the dangers of manipulation, and the importance of forging your own path. Like Cale and his team, we must navigate uncertainty, question what we see, and have the courage to move forward, even when the truth is terrifying. Success, whether in finance, career, or personal growth, requires taking risks, adapting to the unknown, and learning from every failure. Knowledge is the greatest form of freedom, and those who embrace it can shape their destiny. Join the movement. If you enjoyed Visions of Deception, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to inspire others to find their path to success and freedom. Knowledge is freedom, the wisdom to wake up wealth. It's not just a channel, it's a community where storytelling meets financial empowerment. Subscribe at www.youtube.com/@growthwithgerard and unlock engaging, story-driven content designed to help you build a growth mindset, achieve your goals, and thrive. Ready to dive deeper? Explore Gerard's Awakening, A Financial Odyssey, Book 1 of the Multiplex series on Amazon. Small Diamond, get your copy here, Amazon.